The image of Canada is one where the world believes that Canada is a gentle northern neighbor of the United States. What the world sees of First Nations people in Canada is one of beauty and tradition, often seen in powwows and other cultural gatherings. What the world doesn't see is the reality that First Nations face on a regular basis. They don't see the horrific human rights violations that First Nations peoples have been dealing with for generations. For decades, the inaction of successive Canadian governments in dealing with these issues has brought protests and occupations to a head. Not since the 1973 siege at Wounded Knee, South Dakota, has Americans seen such violent confrontations between Indigenous people and governments. Americans are waking up to events in Canada, perhaps questioning the security of their largest foreign oil supply. America needs 21 million barrels of oil a day, 2/3 of which comes from foreign sources. With Hurricane Katrina having taken out 30% of American domestic oil production, a stable supply of foreign oil is essential to the American economy. Since the advent of Native American casinos, violent Indigenous protests have not been the norm in the United States. Nowadays, Native Americans are generally a part of the U.S. economy. Despite a violent history, today many American Indian reservations proudly fly the American flag. There are now 13,000 Native Americans serving in the U.S. military, with 2,000 serving in the front lines in Iraq. Not so in Canada.
The strong message is the Indians have just begun to fight.
If you do not deal with this generation of leaders and seek peaceful solutions, then we cannot promise that you are going to like the kind of violent political action that we can just about guarantee the next generation is going to bring to you.
There was an intensive lobby here in Ottawa for the past week to reinstate Aboriginal rights. For the Native leaders, it's a devastating loss. But they're warning the provinces to expect a hard political fight because Native groups are coming away from this united.
Across Canada, a litany of frustration at the hands of various governments has boiled over into noisy protests.
The drums and chants are songs of Indian honor, and it's the largest demonstration so far in this constitutional fight for Aboriginal rights.
With 30,000 miles of railway lines and over 50,000 miles of oil pipelines in Canada, no one should dismiss the possibility of conflict in Canada. Canada is the United States' largest trading partner. Officially, trade between Canada and the United States is more than $1.5 billion a day. The American economy, representing 28% of the world economy, is heavily subsidized by Canadian resource wealth. Canada's gross domestic product in 2006 was over $1.1 trillion US dollars. Only 9 countries in the world in the $1 trillion club. Only 9 countries in the world have a gross domestic product over $1 trillion US dollars. Those 9 countries have a combined gross domestic product of over $30 trillion and control 68% of the world economy. That leaves over 180 countries in the world with a combined gross domestic product of only $14 trillion or less than 32% of the world economy. The vast majority of the world's people do not share equally in the wealth of the world economy. While Canada and the United States have a combined landmass of over 7 million square miles, Indigenous peoples in Canada do not share in the wealth of the land. North Americans are in the top 10 highest per capita gross domestic product, but the United Nations found that the Indigenous people in Canada were in the 63rd level at the UN Living Index, and the poorest county in the United States is a Native American reservation, Pine Ridge, South Dakota. While Canadian resources subsidize the U.S. economy, Canadian Indigenous people, the original owners of the resources, get no royalties on any of the 60 different metals and minerals mined in Canada. No royalties on the 3 million barrels of oil a day produced by Canada, or stumpage fees on vast forests that are being clear-cut for the benefit of others. There are well over 1,000 land claims across the country not being settled, while Canada continues to sell off hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of Canadian resources every year into the United States. 87.1% of the exports of all Canadian exports flow to the United States. 72% of all foreign investment in Canada comes from the United States. At 3.8 million square miles of land, with a small population of 33 million people, land should not be an issue in Canada, but increasing violence between Indigenous people and the government is centered on who owns the land. 4 immense pipelines are being proposed to take Alberta oil to the United States. Exxon reported in a newspaper article $10.4 billion gross profit in one of its quarters in 2006. Under the North American Free Trade Agreement, Canada is obligated to ensure security of energy exports to the United States. The United States is also legally obligated under American law by the North American Free Trade Agreement to ensure environmental standards for American companies extracting oil in Canada. In 2006, 2 countries, Canada and Russia, voted against the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights, even though the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 17, refers to the fundamental right to property. Canada does not recognize the right to property in its Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In 1982, Canada deliberately omitted the fundamental right to property in its Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The state of Minnesota recently took the plight of Indigenous peoples in Canada seriously. Minnesota buys 40% of all hydro-generated electricity exported from the province of Manitoba. Minnesota passed legislation demanding that the government of Manitoba account for environmental damages caused by huge northern dams, and how that environmental damage affects Indigenous peoples. Housing has been a tremendous problem in terms of human rights. The right to shelter, the right to employment, and protection from unemployment is a huge issue in this, one of the richest countries in the world. First Nation people are dying at a tremendous rate in terms of their health and in terms of housing. Some houses have 25 people to a 2-bedroom house. Unbelievable poverty among the First Nations people. There is a tremendous amount of suicide in northern communities, and the First Nations people are suffering a tremendous amount of deaths among young people. 500 murdered and missing women in Canada. There is a list of these 500 murdered and missing Indigenous women. Indigenous people make up 2% of the Canadian population, but 50% of the people killed at the hands of the police every year are Indigenous people.
Still smoldering barricades were removed this morning from one of southwestern Ontario's busiest highways. Kettle and Stony Point natives decided to remove roadblocks from Highway 21 after meetings with band leaders and Grand Chief Ovid Mercredi.
We got enough bloodshed now. I'm scared there's going to be more bloodshed if it don't come down.
On Sunday, March 22nd, 1998, in Tsuut'ina Reservation in Alberta, RCMP officer Dave Bowler takes a shotgun out of his car and kills Connie Jacobs and her 9-year-old child, Ty Jacobs. Connie had been refusing to let her children go into care. Ty ran around the house that day, yelling, "Leave us alone." Within days, Bowler is cleared by 7 white judges. Within months, he gets a raise and is promoted to sergeant.
I was given a message this morning, not too long ago, that there's a raid going on in Bird Church right now. My chief's been arrested. Many of the other fishermen have been arrested.
But the fisheries officers have a job to do out there. They have to remove traps that are illegal or unauthorized, and they'll continue to do that. Those instructions that go to them are from me and from the department. They're carrying out their responsibility, and they'll continue to do it.
They say we have the freedom of assembly. They say we have those basic fundamental freedoms, and when we try and exercise them, this is what happens. They arrest our people, they handcuff them, they pepper spray them, they throw them in jail.
Get back! Shoot! Shoot! Get him out of here! Shoot!
With the confrontation between the First Nations people and the Government of Canada, clearly the issue is still about the land and resources, and the fact that there is over 1,000 land claims in the system right now, where the Indigenous people end up sitting before a government panel to determine whether or not the land or the rights of the Indigenous people is valid, and that is being determined by a country that voted against the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights. It is very clear that the issue is in terms of land claims and confrontations. It has always been the issue of the land. Canada, being the second largest country in the world, the Indigenous people are still struggling for a proper land base. In fact, they occupy less than 1/4 of 1% of the land base in Canada. It's grotesque in terms of the amount of land that was taken from the Indigenous people. There is a national call for the First Nations people, the Indigenous peoples, to stand together, and for a national day of action to drive home this impending crisis that may include railway blockades. The security of Canadian exports into the United States is something that can be no longer ignored. Human rights violations are not an issue simply for other nations like Russia or China. The violation of Canadian First Nations rights are a regular occurrence in Canada.
Native protesters went on a rampage yesterday in Ipperwash Provincial Park. A rebel splinter group is still in the park, claiming it is the site of a sacred burial ground.
Confrontations have become more aggressive on the First Nations side in terms of direct action. The confrontation have been that the Indigenous people, the people themselves, are starting to tell the chiefs, "We are not waiting for you any longer, and we are not going to wait for a system that does not work. We are not going to wait the average 27 years that it takes to settle a land claim. We are not prepared for that. We are not going to allow the poverty to continue. We are just going to take back our land." And that's what has been happening in Caledonia. What happened in Ipperwash, where Dudley George was shot to death by police. That is what has been happening in Grassy Narrows, where clear-cutting is being opposed directly by blockades. That is what happened in Gustafson Lake, one of the largest police actions ever in the history of Canada. At Oka, where the town of Oka wanted to extend its 9-hole golf course to 18 holes over a known Mohawk gravesite. Human rights are an issue in Canada. China is projected to have a population of an increase of 161 million more people by 2020. In India, the population will increase by close to 300 million people, with both the Chinese and Indian communities booming at close to a 10% yearly growth rate. Canada's northern resources will become premium in a world that will be running out of accessible resources. Americans will have more competition for access to Canadian resources. In the far north, as global warming affects the Northwest Passage, cutting 7,000 kilometers for imports from the Far East, the political status of Canada's 2 million square miles of land, guarded by less than 100,000 people, will become a world issue. For now, the Indigenous people of the North, who make up the majority of those 100,000 people of loyal Canadians, the question is, how long are they willing to see their resources flow south, with limited benefit to them? If Quebec finally succeeds in gaining international sovereignty, will the North remain Canadian? 230 years ago, 13 states in America declared themselves independent of England and its despotic rulers. To take such drastic action as to declare independence meant that Americans needed to justify those actions. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security."
Instructions that go to them are from me and from the department.